Diversity of sexual behavior and sexual interactions in nature is astounding. You know, we see, for example, that females will often reject males that are too aggressive. Even if she was a little interested before, like the minute he becomes like all over the place, she's like, no, just forget it. But a lot of juvenile males fail at the mating game because they don't yet have that language. They don't know how to, really kind of be suave and like, convince the female. They're just like, oh yes, she said yes, okay.
Hello, hey everyone, welcome. Welcome to the first Fridays of 2024. Almost forgot the year. So I'm Joel Kizan, I'm Program Manager here at the Natural History Museum. We're really happy to have you all back for our 17th season. Amazing. So I want to just mention our theme for this season is From Feelings to Pheromones. What does that mean? I don't know. I wrote something. Actually, I didn't write it. MMC wrote it. We hope to explore the forces that shape the behaviors of life forms large and small, from reproduction and propagation in the natural world to the sex life of other species. We're going to untangle the constructs of gender, feelings, and pheromones. We'll also explore some of the predicaments facing all species of life, including over and underpopulation, and hopefully offer some doable solutions we can all participate in. So with that, I want to give a big thanks to our sponsor, U.S. Bank. Can I get a big round of applause for U.S. Bank? Thank you. They appreciate that. And a special thank you to our media sponsors, KCRW. Yay. And our event partner, I Am Sound. Lastly, I want to let everyone know, please check out all the rest of the things happening tonight at the First Fridays. Go to nhm.org for more information. Lots of stuff. Don't forget our main stage is downstairs in the Nature Garden. We have a sensory lounge in the foyer and food trucks and bars all over the place. So you'll find it. So now, actually I want to, before I introduce our host, I want to give a quick disclaimer just to let everyone know that our talk is going to be talking about and going to see images of animal genitalia. That's good, right? Yeah, we like that. Just to let you know. Okay, so now on behalf of NHM, it is my pleasure to introduce our host and moderator for First Fridays this season. This is her 4th year doing this with us. Started during lockdown when we did a virtual First Friday. So driven by a mission to redefine where science storytelling belongs and the belief in the power of science to connect people and communities. We are truly fortunate to have her as our moderator again for a 4th year. Please welcome back neuroscientist and science communicator, Dr. Yewande Pierce.
Thank you, Joel, for the really warm welcome, and I'm so excited to be back. I can't believe this is the 4th year, and each season it gets more and more juicy, so hold on to your seats for this one. I think this is going to be good. So tonight's discussion is the creature dating game and other mating habits of the animal kingdom. So we'll be diving into the captivating world of animal and human mating behaviors, the evolutionary role of pleasure, and the astonishing diversity of genitalia. And believe me, it is very diverse. We'll be revealing the intricate ways life on Earth pursues companionship and reproductive success. So in other words, we're going to be talking a lot about penises and vaginas. I'm so excited to introduce our guest for the discussion. Please welcome Dr. Patty Brennan. Dr. Brennan is an evolutionary biologist. Her research examines the morphological evolution of vertebrate genitalia, in particular female genitalia, that have typically been understudied. She's an associate professor of biology at Mount Holyoke College and obtained her PhD at Cornell University. I feel like we have some good representation in the crowd. in neurobiology and behavior. Again, welcome Dr. Brennan to our discussion this evening.
Thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be here. This is an amazing crowd. Oh my goodness, can't wait.
Before we get started, I just also want to say, while we were sitting in this amazing hall, we were looking at all of the different animals and talking about their genitalia. And Dr. Brennan is very knowledgeable, so I can't wait for us to jump into this discussion. You'll be surprised. So, like I said in the introduction, tonight's discussion focuses on the fascinating parallels between human mating behaviors and those in the animal kingdom. So given the topic, if I was dating, I think I probably would suggest this as a really good date night. So if you are here on a date, you might be flirting or thinking about flirting. So I feel like the first question, just to get us warmed up, is, of course, without over-anthropomorphizing animals by labeling it flirting, would you say it's fair to say that animals participate in some form of mating ritual, no matter the species?
Yeah, absolutely, right? So, sex is never a quick affair, really. It takes a while before animals decide that they want to mate, right? And they do that by checking each other out, essentially. And they, display to each other, right? And they show how beautiful they are, or how well they can sing, or how well they can dance, all sorts of different characteristics that they find attractive. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that this becomes a real conversation, right? So it's not just about, showing something off to your potential partner, but it's about your partner responding to those displays. And it can become very sophisticated, right, between males and females.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we think about, we're talking about animals in this conversation, but even when we think about humans, it's very nuanced. Everyone's talking about getting the ick from this and getting the ick from that. So it's not as black and white as it's, okay, reproduction, that's the goal. Let's have these mating behaviors to get us there. Do you see the same sort of nuance amongst different species?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the diversity of sexual behavior and sexual interactions in nature is astounding, right? It's the main reason why I'm so interested in studying it. And, we see, for example, that females will often reject males that are too aggressive. So if they come on too hard, the female is like, whoa, no. Like, even if she was a little interested before, like the minute he becomes like all over the place, she's like, no, just forget it,
Too
and then
keen.
she goes away.
Too
Yeah, it's like
keen's not
just a little much. Yeah, and so they really have to learn. Like, a lot of juvenile males, sorry to you guys who are young, but a lot of juvenile males fail at the mating game because they don't yet have that language. They don't know how to, really kind of be suave and
the
convince the female. They're just like, oh yes, she said yes, okay. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. So yeah, there is a lot of that, and they have to learn, just like humans have to learn, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And for many animals, it's the exact same thing.
That's super fascinating, especially the part about the aggression. And the aggression isn't favored, because typically I think you think, it's driven by the aggression. So that's, food for thought. Food for thought. So I wanted to jump into sex beyond survival. So reproductive success is something that we've talked about. So if we could just show an image, just bring that up there. Okay, we're going to explain. Evolutionary theories on sex beyond reproduction are beginning to emerge, actually in large part due to your pioneering research. So one important finding that I've read in your work is that dolphins actually have a very impressive clitoris, which is up here on the screen,
yes.
Which really does raise the question of pleasure, for it to be this complex. Pleasure is a fundamental driver of human behavior, but what have you learned about the function of pleasure in animals across the animal kingdom?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and is one that keeps me up at night, because we don't talk about it, right? We don't want to anthropomorphize our animals, so we don't want to ascribe feelings and emotions that we think, we can't interpret because we have to be very objective. But I think we've gone a little too far on the opposite direction of assuming that they don't actually have any of the same feelings and emotions. And dolphins are actually a really good way to help us answer this question, a really good system, because they have sex all the time just for fun and for social reasons, right? And it's not all about reproducing and just coming together to make babies, but they come together really socially. For example, females will have sex with other females as a way of forming social bonds, and then they'll take care of each other's babies, for example. Males will have sex with other males as a way of forming coalitions, so that then they can go together and harass a female and try to get her to populate.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, but these social coalitions are important for them, for their society, right? And so they're having sex not just to reproduce, but to really solidify hierarchies and bonds. And so the question is, of course, if animals are having sex, for example, if females are having sex with other females, it would make a lot of sense that it would feel good. And it turns out that the clitoris of the dolphins hadn't really been well described, and we were doing work on dolphin vaginas. And so every time we open a dolphin vagina, we would see this crazy structure, which is what you're looking at here. And that whole thing is the clitoris, and they have a huge clitoris right at the entrance of the vagina, unlike humans where the clitoris is above the vagina, where it's harder to stimulate. If the clitoris is right inside the vaginal canal, it's really easy to find it, right? You're not gonna get lost. It's like, you know where it's at, and there it is.
Lucky dolphins.
And so what we did was kind of ask this question, well, I can't ask a dolphin, is this feeling good, right?
Yeah.
So I have to figure out, and like some animals are very different. Like with primates, we know, because the females would vocalize, they'll roll their eyes, they'll curl their toes, they'll do things that are like reminiscent of what we humans do. But dolphins don't even have toes, right? So it's like, how do I know she's having a good time? But what you do is you look at the morphology, and then you ask yourself the question, is the morphology indicating some function, right? And so we did this by looking, for example, at this structure right here, which is the erectile bodies of the clitoris. And so these are just like in the penis, erectile bodies that fill up with blood when the females are excited. And the erectile bodies of the dolphins are huge, really well developed, and in the exact same position as they are in human females.
In centimeters?
Say it
Just
again?
or scale, can you, a comparison to something?
About yay big.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's pretty big. And so, and then they have a lot of nerves, and the nerves are huge, right? And the skin is very thin on top of the clitoris compared to the skin adjacent. So they have all the indications that this is an organ that has evolved to actually be easily stimulated. And so, I can't ask a dolphin what it's feeling, but by looking at its morphology, I can infer that it's probably feeling something good when its clitoris is stimulated.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so for the image on the left, how do you capture that image?
Yeah, so this is, and the specimens that we get for this research, they all come from stranding networks. So dolphins and whales strand pretty regularly, and the postdoc that I had, Dr. Dara Orbach, who was working with me at the time, she had contacted all the stranding networks to alert them that we were looking for reproductive tracts. And so we get frozen vaginas in the male, as one does. And then we preserve them in a special way. We soak them with iodine that is a contrast agent, so it makes these soft tissues pop. When you scan them in a CT scanner, which is the exact same thing that you get when you go to the doctor and you say, I have a pain in my neck, and they send you to get a CT scan. We use the exact same technology to look at the soft tissue of the animals.
So you mentioned, so this is a dolphin clitoris, and then we were talking about the humans. The difference here is that it's kind of at the entrance of the tract. Do you see a lot of variation across other life forms as well, or for the ones that you've been able to investigate?
So you mean in the clitoris, or?
The clitoris specifically.
Oh, yeah.
Do they tend to have that?
Oh, yeah, for
Okay.
sure. And so last year we published a paper on the clitoris of snakes. So it's interesting that snakes had been assumed not to have a clitoris, but it turns out that what they have is they have a very small clitoris right at the base of the tail. And we were using the same kind of technology to actually look at the clitoris and describe it and describe differences across the species. So even within snakes, not all snakes have the same kind of clitoris. So some
Right.
snakes have really large clitorises, other snakes have much smaller clitorises. And so they vary across species, which suggests that, again, the sexual experience might be different for these different groups.
That's so interesting, just those variations. And also in a snake, the tail. I would not know where to look. I think that's an interesting thing about your work as well, the fact that you know to look there. I mean, when you got into this research, how did that play?
Well, so what's interesting is, there are a lot of things that we don't know, but things that we can guess at, right? And the clitoris and the penis are actually homologous structures in vertebrates. And what that means is that they derive from the same developmental tissue. So they both get started from these little bumps in the cloacal opening, right? So the kind of the sexual opening of the animals. And then if you are going to become a male, these tissues keep growing and become a penis. If you're going to become a female, they keep growing in a different way, mostly internally, and they become a clitoris. And so once you realize, okay, there's that homology of location, then you know where you have to look. But what's true is that all vertebrate females have a clitoris.
All?
Which, all of them, yeah.
Wow.
So crocodile females, they have a clitoris, it's really big. Turtles have a clitoris, snakes obviously have a clitoris. Mammals, all species of mammals do as well. And so these structures are there, they're highly diversified, morphologically very different, and we're starting to explore some of this diversity to understand, is it functional, right? Does it do something for the females?
And it feels like the take-home message is that pleasure is very important for evolutionary reasons.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, if sex feels good, you want to have more of it, right? And evolutionarily, that's what you want. You want to have more sex so you reproduce more. And so it makes a lot of sense that pleasure would be associated with the sexual experience.
Thank you. That was, I mean, it's leading me now onto the second topic that I wanted to talk about, which of course, naturally, penises. So, decades, and I mean, when I was doing my background research for this discussion, I was really shocked, actually. Decades of research have shown the vast diversity of penises, from bright blue penises, to penises with pink prickles, to penises that fall off after mating. Like, my mind was blown. Yet the knowledge about female sexual organs is lagging behind a little bit. Historically, female perspectives on sexual selection and reproduction, reproductive evolution have been sidelined, but your work is starting to shift that narrative quite a bit. So before we dive into your discoveries, specifically about female genitalia, I wondered, are penises old news? Are there still a lot to be found out about penises, or are we moving on from that?
No, let's not move on from the penises.
Okay.
Penises are great. I love penises. I think penises are pretty amazing. And maybe we can change the photo. And so this image is showing you a bunch of penises of snakes, right? And so in snakes, it turns out snakes have two penises, not one, and they're called hemipenes, right? And what you can see here is, like, look at the diversity of shapes. Some of them are bifurcated, some of them have this cylinder part here and then the bifurcation. Some of them are just cylinders. A bunch of them have spines. So like all these little sticky parts out here are giant spines that then dig into the female, right?
They dig in?
They dig right into the female. But the amazing thing is there's this crazy diversity, and we have known about this for a very long time, that snakes have this crazy penile diversity. But we don't really know why, evolutionarily. Like, why do you, like a penis to do the job it needs to do, it could just be a tube and that's it. But if you look at penises across nature, they're not like a tube. They are incredibly diverse. They derive from multiple parts of the body in different animals. And they have all sorts of weird shapes. Some of them have bones. Some of them are powered by blood. Others are powered by lymph. They can have spines on the surface, but they can also have nice little soft bumps and all kinds of things that seem to be actually very friendly rather than very unfriendly.
Like number one.
Like that guy. I mean, I don't want to be that snake. I don't know what's going on with that. But yeah, and so then there is actually a reason why we should be interested in variation in penises as evolutionary biologists, because they are incredibly cool and diverse. But here's the thing, is that we have been focused on that side of the equation for a very long time, for over a century, right? And it's like, oh, penises, they're so cool, they're so cool. But and they're cool. But the thing about penises is that they have to go somewhere, and the somewhere is called a vagina. And so we can't really just keep looking at the penises and marveling at them. We need to start looking at what's going on in the female,
Right.
because otherwise we're never going to really understand the evolution that's happening in these structures.
That's a really important point. For this level of diversity, I mean, I'd just like to highlight as well, this is just snakes.
This is just snakes.
This is just snakes, and that is an incredible amount of diversity.
Yeah.
So across species, and
Oh, yeah.
obviously
No, it's
there's
not.
still so much to uncover, but I think that it's really important that it's shifting slightly, but also the idea that they have to work together. So essentially it's filling the gap to be able to get to this goal where we're understanding how both adaptations work together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So male penises, they possess a prehensile penis, which, as I understand it, means that they're capable of swiveling. Like, I'm doing this because they actually look like a hand. So they grasp and they grope, and like the snake penis that hooks on, that's part of the reason for why they're formed like that, or they've evolved like that. I guess my question is, what drives the level of diversity? Is it really the female that's driving, like the female's adaptions that are driving the penises, or vice versa?
Well, I mean, I think this is an area of research that we call coevolution. What does that mean? It means that because the penis and the vagina have to fit together, what happens in one has to happen, that has to elicit a response in the other, right? And so if you have all of a sudden a prehensile tip on your penis, it doesn't come out of the blue, right? It's probably
Right.
coming out because something that happened in the female that requires the male to now do something different with his penis. So we really, to answer the question, and the answer to your question is we don't know. I can't really tell you who's driving what, like what's happening in most systems, because we don't have a full picture yet of what's going on with the females to really look at the coevolution. This is what we're trying to do with our research right now, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of studies before we can really figure out what's happening. But I'll tell you, there is one study on beetles that suggests that females might be the drivers of that first evolutionary change. And that kind of makes sense because vaginas evolved before penises, right? And so the opening to the oviduct of where the females are laying eggs precedes the evolution of the penis. And so it's quite possible that the females are the ones in the driver's seat.
So with those beetles, what are their vaginas like?
Yeah, they have convoluted vaginas as well, and especially it's not just the vaginas, but in beetles there are structures in the male that are there to fasten the male to the female, so kind of like these holding on structures. So it's the inner part of the female, which is also called a vagina, and then those external structures as well.
That's interesting. So these images here, so these 3D images, how do you capture that? And then in the lab, because I imagine a lot of the work that you do is on specimens that have been used for something else.
Yeah.
So I imagine the penis isn't the shape of a penis as it would be. So how do you go about actually reconstructing the anatomy to understand it better?
Yeah, so the first thing I have to tell is that, we study a huge diversity of organisms. So in my lab, we study mammals, snakes, sharks, skates, crocodiles, bats. Like, if he has a penis, we're over it. We're going to look at it. And so, there are a lot of people already collecting animals for science, and one of the reasons why I'm at the museum, honestly, is because I collaborate with museums a lot, because they have specimens that are, already coming into the collection. So I can maximize the use of those specimens by looking at their genitals, which nobody else wants to look at. I don't know why, because it's so cool. I end up collaborating with a lot of people who already have disease specimens in their freezers, and then I can look at the reproductive parts, and it works out really well. And then what we do, if it is a male, we'll inflate the penises with different substances to make them approach their functional state as much as we can. And then we 3D scan them. We scan them either with a laser scanner or with photogrammetry or something to reconstruct their 3D shape. If it is a female, how do you study a female? Because the females are internal, right? So the vagina is on the inside. So how do you figure out the shape? Well, what we do is actually, we use dental silicone and we inject the vaginal opening with dental silicone. And the dental silicone will cure inside the vagina, and then we literally pull it out, and now we have a shape of the inside of the female. And what that allows us to do is get a repeatable shape for those structures, because otherwise they're soft tissue and they're hard to study. And so we do the same thing. Once we have the inner shape of the female, we can scan it, and then we can measure it and quantify it and see the differences.
That's so clever. So the dental material that you use when you're having the molds for a crown. Now, anytime I go to the dentist, all I'm going to think about is thank you, Dr. Brennan.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Another interesting fact that I came across about penises is, so in your work, you have an extensive background, but you started with birds. And I was reading birds, correct me if I'm wrong, only 3% of birds still have their penises?
Yes, exactly.
So where did they go?
Yeah, where did they go? I know,
and
exactly.
And why? It would be great to talk about that.
Yeah, so, the way I always tell this story is basically by saying to people that I did not wake up one day and went, oh, penises and vaginas, that's where my career is going. It just doesn't work out like that. But I was studying these birds in Costa Rica called tinamous, and I was studying their mating system. It's very interesting. They have this exclusive male parental care. And I was watching them one day in the field, and then I saw them mate. And it was unlike any mating I've ever seen. So birds mate very quickly. They do something called a cloacal kiss because they don't have penises, right? So they briefly touch their cloacas. The male transfers sperm in a second, and then they separate and they're done. But what I saw that day in the field is the male grabbed the female by the neck, and they got up together and they started walking, stuck together. And I was like, what?
What's going on?
What's happening? And then when they separated, I saw this thing hanging off his cloaca, and then he started pulling it in, and I was like, oh, that's a penis. No. Because I had no idea. And I was at the lab of ornithology at Cornell. This is where I was doing my research. And I had never heard the word bird and penis put together in the same sentence, right? So I had absolutely no idea bird penises were a thing. So I started reading and investigating about it when I came back from the field. And it turns out that the reason why I hadn't heard about it is because nobody was studying it. And as you say, only 3% of birds have a penis, of modern birds, right? And evolutionarily, that's a fascinating question because the penis is pretty handy,
Right.
And so why did it go away? Why would evolution make such a structure disappear? And so that was originally my interest. I was interested in the penis just like everyone else. But the second I saw my first bird penis, like on dissection, then I was like, and what do the females look like?
Yeah, exactly.
Because you can't look at a penis without wondering where is it going, where is it parked? So.
Which is a perfect segue, actually, to talk about female genitalia. So your research focuses on covering a lot of these fascinating variations in female genital morphology. And like you said, I guess a good way to start is to look at the penis. If the penis is interesting, then it's fair to assume that the vagina is going to be even more interesting. And we talked about coevolution. If we could just go to the next picture. Dr. Brennan, let's talk about
what's happening, Dr. Brennan? Why are you showing us this? Okay, first of all, I swear this is not Photoshop. This is actually
I actually asked this.
This is real. So this is a harbor porpoise, and you can actually see these guys out of the Golden Gate Bridge. And they really have massive genitalia, the males do. And not only that, but they're jumping and like leaping out of the water and doing all sorts of acrobatics, which I don't understand how, the physics of this. But what's really fascinating is that this is what the vagina looks like, right?
It's absolutely beautiful. It's like a sculpture.
So that inner part of the female vagina is extraordinarily complicated, which would explain why the male penis needs to look like this, right? Is the fact that it's so complex. And also because dolphins do a lot of sexual harassment. So the males will harass the female to get her to copulate with the male until she acquiesces to copulate. And basically they don't let her eat, they don't let her socialize until she agrees to have sex. And so,
Wow.
so in a way, you know, the females are kind of having these very convoluted vaginas to deal with the evolution of the male genitalia.
That's
Yeah.
absolutely, nature is so smart. So that's called, that's co-evolution. But what's interesting is it's not just dolphins that you found this in.
Oh, God, no.
I've waited a little bit because the one thing that you're really known for is your work with ducks.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about that now. But ducks have a similar kind of co-evolution that
Yeah.
has allowed the females to have a little bit more autonomy.
Yeah, exactly. And so you know, when I started doing my work after I was working on the tinamous, instead of staying with the tinamous, because they're very difficult to study, I started looking at ducks, and ducks have penises. They're in that small percentages of birds that have penises. So I started looking at ducks. You know, we eat ducks, we farm them, they're everywhere. People have them as pets, you know, they're a pretty ubiquitous creature. And what happened was that it turns out nobody had asked the question of what do the female vaginas look like. And so the minute I dissected my first duck in the lab, I went to a farm in the UK, which is where I was at the time, and I dissected this male, I saw the penis, and I was like, oh, so what does the vagina look like? And so I went to my PI and I said, so what does the vagina look like? And he said, I don't know. And I said, okay. So I drove back to the farm, and I told the farmer, can I have 2 females now, please? And he was like, okay. And so he gave me 2 female ducks, and I dissected them, and I almost fell off my chair because they also had these incredibly convoluted vaginas.
Wow.
Yeah.
What did you see in?
Yeah, so
Do
maybe
we
we
have
can
an-
show,
I think we have
I
an
think it's
image.
not the next one, but the last one. So
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
we can go forward to that one. Yeah, that one. So this is what duck genitalia look like. So this is the male penis. So the male
it's like
penis
it's really twisted.
is
and-
twisted. It's a corkscrew shape, and it has an external sperm channel. And then this is what the female looks like. So if you were to look at any other female bird, you would see just a tube. So it's basically just a normal straight tube. And female ducks have these crazy blind pouches at the entrance of the vagina, and then all these spirals that spiral in the opposite direction from the male penis. So if these were rigid structures, copulation would be impossible.
Right.
But what's really amazing is we did all these tests and all these experiments, and we showed that these structures really prevent the penis from fully everting. And they have evolved because the male ducks force females to copulate.
So fascinating. So this has happened over time because the males have evolved to manipulate the outcome of reproduction for their advantage, and then the females co-evolve in a way that allows them to take back some of that autonomy and have a bit more power in.
Exactly,
That's so
and I
clever.
think that that's a really powerful finding, because we always hear about females as being passive, or females about somehow being the victims or the recipients. And this evolutionary story, in my mind, was basically a way to say, you know, yeah, sex in ducks is hard, and sometimes it can be
Yeah.
violent, but the females, of course, are expected to co-evolve a response that allowed them to regain their sexual autonomy because it is important to them, right? So in evolution, sexual autonomy is important to females, and that's something that, you know, we need to keep in mind when we consider the different strategies that evolve, especially with relation to sex. So this was amazing because, you know, the females have evolved a way that they can prevent males from succeeding in these forced copulations.
And so this is happening in these are just 2 examples. Dolphins, ducks, very different creatures, both have these adaptations. Could we go back to the slide
Yeah.
before? Because this to me is absolutely beautiful. So
Yeah.
this is the variation that we're talking about in female vaginas.
Yeah, so this is just basically a composite picture of the inside of the vaginas of a whole bunch of different vertebrate species, right? And how many of you are surprised, by the way? Because most people think vaginas are like cylinders, right? Because that's what they show in most illustrations. Yeah, it's like-
I was very surprised.
I know, and then
Very
they're like,
surprised.
but they're not a cylinder at all. They're like these complicated, convoluted, beautiful structures that are just as diverse as the penises are, and that shouldn't be surprising because they have to work and interact with the penis, right? So they're very diverse. And this is only one dimension of variation. So this is showing shape variation. But what we see in the lab, for example, is also that they vary in the tissues themselves, like how hard are the vaginal walls. And there are species where the vaginal walls can distend a whole bunch and species where they're completely rigid. There are species that have very thick pockets in particular places of the vagina so that if the male has spines, then that pouch is going to receive those spines, right, to minimize the damage. And so, there is variation in how the vagina functions, how much it can contract, for example, during copulation. So all of these dimensions of variation allow the females to regain some of that sexual autonomy and protect themselves evolutionarily from damage.
That's amazing. Are there any compromises to that in terms of, like, is there a sweet spot for that back and forth? Because it could just go on and on and on.
There is, absolutely, 100%. So if you think about the ducks, the females not only are having sex, of course, the other big thing they have to do is they have to lay eggs. And you can imagine laying an egg if you're a female duck. It's not an easy thing because the egg has to pass through all these labyrinths of the female vagina, right? It's not as easy as going through a tube. So there's definitely a cost to these structures. It's not cost-free. And what this does is that it halts that evolutionary process when the cost of, for example, having an egg stuck in your vaginal canal becomes too high. And at that moment, then you just don't, you can't continue exaggerating the trait anymore.
Wow, that's amazing. Talking of diversity, some of this research actually did come under some scrutiny in the media, unfortunately, because, and this is why science communication is so important.
Yes.
It's valid, like, why would you invest all of this money into understanding penises and vaginas? But I know that you're a huge advocate for celebrating the diversity within nature, especially with genitalia, but also we've talked a lot about penises and vaginas, but intersex as well are some of the findings that you found. So I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on why diversity in this research is so important.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're asking me a question that can be answered in many different ways. I would say definitely one thing about, the kind of science I do is, of course, because of the person that I am, right? And so, of course, I'm a woman, I have a vagina, right? So if I see a penis that's weird, like my first question is like, oh, so what does the vagina look like? But that hasn't really been true in science because we have had a lot of white males doing science for a very long time.
Right.
Now, the thing that's problematic about that is that if you only have those perspectives in science, then you can't really get deep enough into the answers, right? Because you're lacking perspective. I also happen to be Latina, right? Which means that I come from a culture where talking about sex is not a huge taboo. There are people in the world who come from cultures where you can't even say the word penis or vagina out loud because it's really like a crime, like literally a crime. So, the diversity of who's asking the questions and what kinds of questions are interesting to them is hugely important. But then the other dimension is the diversity of the type of question that you're asking. And one of the questions that people often have is like, well, why are you not curing cancer, right? Like, why study penises and vaginas? Yeah, well, it might be kind of funny, but there's cancer in the world. Like, why don't you study cancer and do something that's going to solve some medical problem or make money in some way, right? I might have to do like an animal line of sex toys or something. That might be the way I can make money.
There's a huge market for that. This is such a good idea.
Otherwise I don't see it. But anyway, what they're asking when they're asking that question is, why am I doing basic science, which is what this line of research and inquiry really is, which is basically the kind of science that you do when you want to understand the world and how the world works, right? And so you observe this incredible diversity in nature, and you want to explain it, right? You want to say, why is it there? How did it come about? How does it work? And that's fundamentally very different from applied science, which is the science that we do when we want to cure cancer, and we have a particular problem to tackle, and we are looking for answers to solve an issue, right? So COVID, for example, and coming up with a vaccine for COVID is a perfect example of an application. But what people miss when they are asking that question is that there is an absolutely vital connection between the basic science and the applied science. And Louis Pasteur actually talked about it as the tree and the fruit of the tree, right? So he said, the fruit of the tree is the applied science, is the fruit, the thing that you can actually do something with. But the tree is what nourishes the fruit, and the tree is the basic science. If we do not invest in basic science, if we don't understand at a fundamental level how the world works, then we're not going to have the fruit either. So we have to do both, right? And so in the US, for example, rightly so, we invest most of our money in science, in applied science, which is perfectly fine. But we still need to invest in basic science, and it's an investment that has paid off over and over again. So to go back to the COVID example, we had the vaccines for COVID so quickly because of all the basic science that people were doing about just figuring out what are these weird coronaviruses.
How do you harness?
How do you look at these weird surface proteins that they have, and things that nobody thought they were going to have an application until the problem came. And so the point is, this is completely unpredictable, right? We can't say, oh, I'm going to do this thing with penises because I'm going to solve a problem. We just don't know. So not every basic science project will end up in an application, but every single application require a basic science project.
I couldn't agree more, and that was a great analogy and a great explanation. I want to leave a little bit of time to ask the audience some questions. I'm sure they have lots of questions. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand, and a member of NHM staff will hold on to the microphone while you ask a question. I think we already have one right over there.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I was curious about if you've seen any impact of the Anthropocene on domesticated animals, simplifying or reducing the complexity versus their wild counterparts?
Oh, that's a really good question. So with ducks, I studied ducks quite a bit. And what I found in ducks is that what goes away is the seasonality of the genitalia. So for example, birds, they're highly seasonal breeders. So if you see a duck during the non-breeding season, its penis is tiny. Which is really cool, right? Because it shrinks and it grows. And there's where the money would be, by the way, because if somebody could figure out, like, how to make a penis grow, like, imagine the applications of that.
That would be the applied
science.
science
Yeah, that would be your applied science. It's not going to be me, because that's not the kind of science that I do. But yeah, so that seasonality is pretty marked in wild animals. And so, but when you look at domesticated ducks have lost that seasonal pattern because they're being bred to be able to produce all the time, all year round. And so those males keep their penis long throughout the year, which is pretty crazy. But other than that, I don't really think that there's a lot of work really doing this kind of comparison, but it's really a fascinating question.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Hi. I was really taken at the beginning of your discussion when you were talking about not only, I think most of us have heard about dolphins having sex for pleasure, but same-sex copulation for pleasure. And I was just curious if there are other species that do it, and if there is any correlation between that, including with humans.
Right, yeah, exactly. So that's an awesome question. So I'll tell you definitely bonobos, which I know everybody talks about the bonobos, but the bonobos are great. So bonobo females have a social behavior called GG rubbing, which is genital rubbing, where they basically have homosexual sex all the time, sometimes multiple times a day, where they'll rub their clitorises together. And the clitoris of the bonobo is also huge compared, for example, with the clitoris of the chimpanzee, which is its sister group. And if you ask me, I would say, all that homosexual sex probably has something to do with it. But the problem is that we can't really test that hypothesis right now because we don't have enough data. Humans, similarly, there's good indication that homosexual sex has been around human societies for a very, very long time, whether we want to admit it or not. And so really understanding how that social behavior is shaping clitoris morphology, I think, is a fascinating question. And one that I can't quite give you an answer for yet, but I hope sometime in the future we'll know a lot more. And how common homosexual behavior is, I will tell you that I've lost count, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species that have homosexual sex on a regular basis, for fun, for pleasure, for practice, for pair bonding, and for all the reasons you can imagine. So it is super widespread in nature.
That's a great
Back
question.
to your left. I will be asking this question on their behalf. Is there research being done on intersex characteristics in animals? And have you or your colleagues come across intersex characteristics in research?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that
We were
they
just
have
talking
it.
about
We were just
this.
talking about this when we were having dinner. So literally, we're doing a project on pythons right now. Do you know that the Burmese pythons that are invasive in Florida in the Everglades, they're trying to eradicate these pythons, but it's really hard, and they're invasive, and they're doing a lot of damage in the Everglades. But we're collaborating with the group that's doing this removal. So we've dissected about 90 pythons, and we just found an intersex individual. And so she had a vaginal pouch, but because we're interested in the clitorises, we opened up the base of her tail. And instead of having hemiclitorises, she had full-fledged hemipenes. And so it was an intersex snake. And we found one 2 years ago, a rattlesnake as well, that was intersex. And so it turns out that actually in snakes, it's not uncommon to have intersex phenotypes. But it's hard to identify them if you don't know what you're looking for. And so I think that a lot of scientists have actually missed them because you have to know what the female looks like, what the male looks like, and what something that's combining some of the features may look like. But
That's such a good question, because we were talking about that, weren't we, and the importance of diversity. Because it's you're looking for the clitoris, that's why you were able to find that finding. And it was really interesting what you said about the sample size too. It was only it was 80, and you found
we found one out of
in 80, which is
I mean, in humans, it's supposed to be 1.5% of humans are intersex. So that jives with that statistic. So
yeah, great question.
Hi. So kind of going back to the question about, homosexual mating in the animal kingdom, I'm curious about the different diversity of types of stimulation you're seeing. Is it penetrative? Is it external? And do you start to see that bleed over into heterosexual interactions as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I actually don't study dolphin behavior. There are lots of people out in the field who study this, and it's been really well described. So dolphins will use, for example, their flippers to stimulate each other. So they use their little flippers in there, and they use their snouts as well. And they also masturbate with objects that they find in the forest floor and in the ocean floor. Yeah. So, they're creative. They have a big brain. They know how to use it.
They're very intelligent. And this is the empathy that we need by understanding this animal behavior. One of the things that you had said in a previous conversation was that we didn't invent anything. And I love that. Like, it's all in there in nature, and we just have to.
Yeah, if we think we humans are so special, and we really haven't invented anything. Like, nature has done it all. And actually, I should make a plug, because I think that next month you guys are going to show the documentary Second Nature that actually touches back into a lot of these topics, which I can see you Californians are deeply interested in.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a great...
I wonder why.
The audience always have such fantastic questions. I think we might have time for another one.
Pandas have a reputation for being uninterested in mating. Do we have any idea about whether there's something in their sexual morphology that causes that?
This is a really interesting point, and there's a woman, her name is Lucy Koch, who's a zoologist, and she has written extensively about this. So it turns out pandas actually are not uninterested in sex. They need a little bit of social facilitation before they learn how to do it properly. So, there are zoos that basically show little panda porn to their pandas. Because they need to see it. Otherwise, they really just don't know. They're like, I know I'm supposed to do something here, but I just don't know what it is. And so they need a little learning. We all need a little help. I mean, it's not that easy.
That's incredible, like actual videos. I think there's another question.
Hi, Mom.
I'm I'm interested if you've learned anything about asexuality in the animal kingdom.
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. So, in fact, I was talking to the curator of herpetology here at the museum, Greg, today, because I think that is a fascinating question. Sex and asexuality are both really common in nature, and asexuality is evolved multiple times as well. It's a perfectly good strategy, and it works just fine. And it turns out there are several vertebrates that have reverted from being sexual to becoming asexual. And I'm really curious about seeing what happens to the vagina when that happens, right? Because the vagina is, of course, not just for sex. Sex is good and all, but it is also there to facilitate egg laying and giving birth, right, if you give live birth. So I'm really curious to see if you're an asexual species, what happens to your genitalia? How are they modified when that pressure of sex is not there? So asexuality is very common, and we're finding that it's more common than we had thought even in invertebrates. So it's been parthenogenesis, which is the ability of females to give birth without having sex with a male, has been described in multiple species of snakes. It's been described in lizards, in snakes, and so this is definitely a very fascinating and not uncommon strategy.
We need more funding in this field, evidently.
Yeah. More money for sex, I know, and lack of.
Yeah, and lack of, exactly, diversity across the board.
This will be our last question.
Okay, we have one more question.
I was wondering if you found out why the birds evolved to stop having penises?
Oh gosh, it's such a good question. So here's the problem, is that there has been one independent loss of the penis in the evolutionary history of birds. So you have a single event like that, testing what we call a phylogenetic hypothesis, which is trying to really understand like how this happened in species, becomes impossible because it's a sample size of one, basically. But there are a couple of ideas, and so I'll talk about those. One idea is that it may have something to do with avoiding sexually transmitted diseases. That is because birds have a higher body temperature than other, Archosaurus or some other animals that are not mammals. Birds are warm-blooded, basically, same as mammals. But they have a cloaca, and that means that they have one opening for everything. So they might have a lot more bacteria and a lot more potential for infection than other groups. And so it might be that reducing the penis and then eliminating the penis may have reduced the risk of sexually transmitted diseases. And there are some people who are starting to study STDs in birds, and so we might be able to get an idea whether this is true. But the other idea is that maybe that loss of the penis had something to do with this female choice, actually, because the males were using their penis as a weapon, really, especially if you think about ducks, for example, using their corkscrew penis to do these forced copulations. Then maybe that imposed selection so that males that were less violent were preferred by females, and that leads to a reduction of the penis evolutionarily. And if you look at birds, birds by and large do not have forced copulations because they can't. They don't have a penis to force females. So the females have to really agree to copulate. So it gives the females more power in some way.
Thank you. Wow, that was a fantastic discussion. Thank you all so much for joining our discussion and your amazing questions. And Dr. Brennan, thank you for sharing your insights. That was absolutely amazing.
Thank you.